Could someone of Martin's character, makeup and intellect have carried out the Port Arthur Massacre? Some of the activities that took place suggested that the shooter had a very high degree of training. The shooter was able to accomplish a very high kill ratio in a very short amount of time that a lot of professional soldiers and people that are very proficient with firearms have said that there are very, very few people in the world that can achieve that kind of result. Welcome to the Wasp Files. Some of this material may be distressing and viewer discretion is advised. The main question on everyone's lips regarding the Port Arthur Massacre is, was Martin Bryant solely responsible for the tragedy? A follow-up question is, was Martin Bryant capable of carrying out something as heinous as the Port Arthur Massacre? So I'd like to discuss his aptitude, his ability, his mental state, and his physical prowess, if you like, and skills, particularly with firearms, in order to be able to carry out what most modern-day terrorists would consider to be a successful assault on the civilian population. It's been well reported that Martin had an IQ of 66, which makes him the mental equivalent of an 11-year-old child. He was a grown man, of course, and had a lot of mental disadvantages. This had been reported that he may also have had an Asperger's type syndrome and possibly suffered from schizophrenia. A lot of the medical diagnoses of Martin's mental state have been fairly nebulous. Nothing's really been locked down as to exactly what were his skills and his deficiencies. Relating to a mental disadvantage, if you like, is also considerations of physical disadvantages such as eye-hand coordination, the ability to reason, the ability to improvise, to think on his feet, to be able to pre-plan and to carry out, in essence, a well-planned and large-scale magnitude physical assault with firearms that ended up with such a high kill ratio that people were astounded to this day. Could someone of Martin's character, makeup and intellect have carried out the Port Arthur Massacre? There has been some question as to the aptitude of Martin Bryant, particularly in regards to his low IQ, in being able to strategize and use tactics that a lot of the military employ, who are trained, of course, in a very proficient use and lethal use of firearms. One of these was that Martin Bryant had taken a lot of trips overseas because he'd inherited a lot of money, which enabled him some degree of freedom to be able to travel, even though a lot of his finances were controlled under a public trustee. So Martin had been able to organise trips overseas, book tickets and take flights and book in luggage, apparently, which suggests that, he was able to be capable of undertaking international flight to many countries. One of the most notable of these was that he took a trip specifically to Hereford in England. Hereford is a very sensitive place. It's a home of the Special Air Service, the British highly trained commando regiment, and also home of British intelligence. Martin Bryant had attended there on a holiday and apparently had acted in such a way that there were some suspicions about his activities that raised a red flag back home. This hasn't been detailed in any great extent, but that apparently was reported, that he had in essence been hanging around the military bases in Hereford in the UK. Some theorists are saying that that was where he may have been trained. There are also reports that when he came back from that trip, which was one of the last that he undertook before the Port Arthur Massacre, that he was in quite a distressed state, quite agitated and not happy, yet to be determined once again. So there are also indications that he had read military publications, and some of the activities that took place during the Port Arthur Massacre suggested that the shooter had a very high degree of training. So to differentiate, we've got Martin Bryant with a low IQ and reported incidences where he was not very well versed with firearm usage and operation, and had some difficulties with not only his mental state but also his eye-hand coordination. Martin was left-handed, not right-handed. By all reports, the shooting that took place at the Broad Arrow Cafe is an astounding feat. At least 20 victims were taken in a very short amount of time in that one location. That's the majority of the overall amount of victims that were taken, which was 35 killed and 28 injured on the day. The gunman had entered the cafeteria, purchased a meal, sat out on the balcony, came in, withdrew the Colt SP1 and opened fire on the patrons that were seated in the cafe. In the space of approximately 2 minutes, though it was reported by prosecutor Damien Bugg that the shooting duration in the cafe was 90 seconds, the shooter had killed 20 people. 7 of those were killed because the fire exit door at the Broad Arrow Cafe had been nailed shut, and they were killed as they tried to escape through the fire exit door and were crowded in that environment when the shooter was able to gun them down. Most of the victims were killed with headshots that were fired from the hip by the gunman. Witnesses stated that the gunman was very calm, very collected, and also it was reported that he was dancing in the terms of how he moved with the firearm, that he would spin, lift the rifle, acquire a target, open fire. There was no spray and pray. The execution of the victims and the use of the firearm was very controlled, very accurate, and resulted in a high amount of people's deaths, mainly from headshots, in a very short amount of time before the gunman then exited the Broad Arrow Cafe, not in any panicked way, not running, basically walking out of the cafe, as one witness said, like he was on a stroll.
Standing there looking at him. He walked right by me, not far away from me, just walked out of there as casual as can be.
It was reported that whilst in the cafe, the shooter had fired 29 shots from a 30-round magazine, which the Colt SP1 was able to hold. This is considered to be a military tactic in the sense that when you're in an enclosed space and there is some kind of danger of being apprehended or someone trying to grab the rifle, before changing magazines, trained individuals leave one round in the breech of the rifle so that whilst they are reloading, the gun is never empty. That way, if someone tries to grab the rifle, they can quickly employ that against the person making that attack before placing a new magazine into the well and continuing shooting. It's considered to be a military tactic. Whether or not this is learned or luck in regards to the shooter or just training, it basically prevented the shooter from being apprehended and stopped. There were some of the patrons at the cafe had attempted to distract the shooter. One of them threw a tray to try and distract the gunman from opening fire, but the shooter knew what they were doing. They were very calm, very methodical. There didn't seem to be any highly emotive state, which comes down once again to training and mental aptitude, because in the event of something like a combat situation, a lot of physiological and psychological factors come into play. As stated before, it's not just as easy as pulling a trigger. There's a rush of adrenaline. There's a heightened sense of emotive state, given the panic of the people around you, people running, people scrambling, people ducking and dodging. The noise alone in a confined space, any rifle fired would cause some degree of hearing loss. So whether or not the shooter had some form of hearing protection beneath the blonde hair is yet again to be determined. But all of these factors can distract somebody from the accuracy and proficiency of their use of the firearm. The shooter was able to, however, accomplish a very high kill ratio in a very short amount of time that a lot of professional soldiers and people that are very proficient with firearms have said that there are very, very few people in the world that can achieve that kind of result. One of these was a very decorated Australian soldier by the name of Brigadier Ted Sarong, who had stated that there was maybe 3 people in the world that could achieve that level of kill ratio. He was a decorated and very highly trained Australian soldier. Once the shooter had exited the cafe, he switched to a much more powerful and long-range firearm, which was the FN-FAL, and continued shooting. The other aspect of the Port Arthur Massacre is the multiple staged events. So you've got the initial shooting at the Broad Arrow Cafe, and then the shooter was able to think on their feet and improvise. They exited the cafe calmly, as one victim said, like they were on a stroll. There was no running, there was no panic. They continued shooting outside before making their way down to the buses and engaging victims around and on the buses, in one case shooting fatally a victim through the window of a bus from the interior of a parallel parked bus. So many more victims were taken outside at greater ranges before the shooter then made their way to their Volvo and drove out of the Port Arthur historic site. Along the way, there were more victims taken, and once again an improvised assault took place near the toll booth, where the shooter was able to commandeer a vehicle after killing 4 people that were involved in that situation at the toll booth, and switching vehicles and then making their way down towards a service station nearby, where they pulled over and intercepted a vehicle that was exiting the service station. They managed to kidnap one of the male occupants of the vehicle at gunpoint and force them into the boot of the car before returning and killing the male occupant's girlfriend, Zoe Hall. Then that BMW with the hostage inside was driven towards the Seascape cottage, which was set up to be and pre-planned to be the site of the final siege that was to take place at the climax of the Port Arthur Massacre. The shooter stopped near the driveway entrance to the Seascape cottage along the side of the access roads to Port Arthur and opened fire on oncoming vehicles that were travelling on the roads, causing further damage, injury, disabling vehicles. Before making their way down to the cottage, the BMW was later set on fire, and the resultant siege that took place at Seascape employed a number of tactics which were considered to be very clever in terms of suggesting that there was more than one shooter at the Seascape cottage, which may or may not have been the case. This has not been determined once again in a court of law, but many indications were that there were tactics involved and use of weapons involved that gave the shooter a great degree of skill and proficiency. Police that were fired upon were pinned down for hours with bullets very, very close to where they were located. The shooter had night vision equipment on one rifle with which he was able to spot Special Operations Group creeping up on the Seascape cottage. And also there were indications that lights were being turned on and off, distractions were being created to give the impression that they weren't sure where the shooter was, how many there were, what firearms were being used. Multiple firearms were being discharged. Those who don't know much about firearms at all claim very easily that anyone could do what Martin Bryant did, and that is totally inaccurate. Even at the close ranges that a lot of the firearms were discharged, it's not as easy as just pulling a trigger. So the question comes into it, was Martin Bryant trained? How proficient was he in not only being able to operate firearms, but being able to deploy them against human beings? It's one thing to shoot targets. It's very much another thing to shoot live people, particularly in a traumatic and frightening situation. Martin didn't own firearms, and Martin, in essence, was a shooter. When he was aged 14, his father bought him an air rifle, and apparently he used to not only shoot birds with the with the slug gun, as they used to be called, but was reported to shoot at tourists when they stopped to, pick fruit that had been placed by the side of the road for them to purchase. This was considered to be a strong indication of his violent and antisocial behaviour. From personal experience, and I know growing up as a child where I was living, every kid had a slug gun, as they were known, air rifle, before they were considered to be air arms that needed to be registered as weapons. Every kid had a slug gun, and every summer they would decimate the bird population. That was almost like a pride of place where someone would come to school and say, "Oh yeah, I shot 26 birds this summer." As unethical as that may seem, air rifles and slug guns were pretty much another part of any kids or teenagers' upbringing back in the early days of the 1970s easily up to the 1980s. And Martin Bryant was not really anomalous in that regards. He had a slug gun, and he used a slug gun. I do know that when I was around at that time as a child, that there were people too that would shoot at cars, not to deliberately hurt people, but it was a very irresponsible use of slug guns because they were not considered to be lethal, though certainly you could lose an eye with an air rifle. So Martin apparently was a good shot with an air rifle. Later on, of course, as he grew into manhood and came into some money from the wealthy heiress Helen Harvey, he was able to purchase firearms. Firearms of a much higher calibre and relevant lethality if misused. There is still a little bit of mystery as to exactly how many firearms Martin Bryant owned, whether they were legally purchased, and more importantly, how proficient he was with those firearms. Martin, by his own claims, was that he didn't shoot a lot, that he would take paper targets out in the bush and shoot the paper targets. Whether or not he was a super accurate shooter with some of the firearms that he allegedly did own, such as the Colt SP1 and the FN-FAL rifle, a AAA Australian Arms semi-automatic rifle was discovered hidden in a piano at his house in Clare Street, Newtown. Never been determined whether that firearm was used or shot. I don't have any indications of whether he used to shoot at a gun club. He also had the Daewoo semi-automatic shotgun, and he claimed that he didn't shoot it because it sort of frightened him, which is a very unusual thing to say for someone who enjoyed firearms. Colt SP1s and FN-FALs also make quite a loud noise and could be considered to be frightening to fire. Some of the reports from people that had interactions with Martin Bryant supposedly seem to indicate that he was not very proficient in the handling of the guns that were in his possession. Prior to Port Arthur, somebody had decoyed the only two police close to the Port Arthur site away from Port Arthur. Their job in a critical response was to close the swing bridge across to the mainland, in essence to control any emergency site. These two officers were decoyed 30 minutes away to the other side of the island at the saltwater mines on a bogus hunt for drugs that supposedly had been found there. Once the constables arrived, they discovered jars of soap powder. Whilst they were over there at the mines, the shooting took place at Port Arthur. That is a very clever decoy endeavour to get the only two police officers that could have attended immediately to the Port Arthur site away, in essence leaving the entire site unguarded. There were no armed guards and there were no police nearby. So when you take all of this together, it's a well-planned and multiply staged mass casualty inflicting event. So considering that, with Martin Bryant's abilities, if you like, was he able to achieve something like this? It's a mystery, given his low intellect and his disadvantages, which the press and the psychologists are very quick to point out that he had all of these kind of issues and he certainly had dysfunctional and violent tendencies. But they haven't really determined how someone of that nature could carry out something as proficient and ruthlessly successful, for want of a better term, as the Port Arthur Massacre. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Wasp Files. Feel free to share far and wide, and see the attached files in support of the episode. Thank you.